Hi all, and welcome to week 6. We're covering 3 chapters, and this will be a relatively short video. So let's go ahead and dive into the additional things we want to talk about beyond the reading. So looking at what polarization has been about in the modern era, we've seen 2 different approaches in the 2 most previously recent presidents before President Biden. Obama ran very explicitly on a rhetoric of unity, and this seemed to work very well electorally. It was a popularly received message. No red states, no blue states, one United States. This really was hope, change, unity. These were the rhetorical pillars of what Obama was attempting to do. And, obviously he got elected on this, and also, his general underlying approval ratings were fairly strong for a polarized era. But, both approval-wise and in terms of, down-ballot elections and accomplishments, this didn't really work out in governance. So, pretty much all of the major accomplishments in the Obama era, the legislative accomplishments, were early on in his 8 years during a time when there was unified and there were on party lines, right? So obviously most notably the Affordable Care Act, sometimes even known as Obamacare, was not at all a bipartisan accomplishment, and Obama's initial goal was for it to be bipartisan. Part of the design was, let's take something that a Republican governor put in place in Massachusetts and build it out nationally. In theory, this is a compromise that is, not what the left-wing Democrats wanted, a full, universal, single-payer style healthcare, but something that would combine expanding coverage with a marketization of healthcare, essentially making healthcare able to be bought and sold, right? So that was the goal. And, while that is sort of what passed in terms of legislatively, there was no bipartisan cover for it. Republicans ran against it for the next decade. And generally, you can see that Republicans, and Mitch McConnell in particular has been fairly open about saying this, was that any legislative compromises, anyone voting for this would make it bipartisan healthcare reform. And once it was bipartisan healthcare reform, it would be more popular just by virtue of the bipartisan label. Voters who aren't deeply engaged will think, well, both parties like this. It's probably pretty good given how much trouble there is getting both parties to like anything. And that also would have been seen as Obama was succeeding in uniting people. And so Republicans rationally denied him victories. You get Republican success down ballot in the Tea Party wave of 2010. And, while they don't win the 2012 election and Obama does win a second term, Obama is, far less popular than he presumably would have been had the whole unity bipartisanship worked out for him in practice. Then we get Trump running very openly on polarization. And while this worked, so to speak, I do want to point out that it was probably a bit less electorally successful than it seems. One of the, I think, most fascinating questions in politics is exactly what is it about Trump that works, right? And one, take from the political science researchers essentially is, and this is what Drutman says directly in the reading, the election went about as one might have expected if a generic Democrat and a generic Republican went up against each other. So maybe there wasn't anything particularly special about Trump in terms of results. Both Trump and Clinton were relatively unpopular for nominees, but maybe negative polarization has just locked in these results to the extent where it doesn't matter that much whether you run on unity, run on polarization. If you have your party's nomination, you will get such and such vote share, and the factor that's most likely to swing things back and forth is how the economy is doing at the time, because all presidential elections are to some extent a referendum on the sitting president and, how well the country as a whole, and usually specifically how well the economy is doing. Okay, so I really like Drutman's point that all politics is conflict, and I also think that there's a pretty helpful taxonomy in here where he suggests the 2 biggest lenses of conflict are who gets what and who are we. And then further notes that, when this economic question of who gets what dominates politics, we often get a reduction in inequality. And the reason for this is just that, like, the people who can vote for redistribution and benefit from it outnumber the people on the other side. Right? So, like, higher taxes on the wealthy are generally popular. Like, even among Republicans, I think this is something like a 50-50 split within the party. So, like, while the party line is very definitively, like, no new taxes, as far as, like, most voters are concerned, I think you get something in the range of, like, 70% overall support for, like, higher taxes on the wealthy in order to, fund services for a more universal majority. When other identities dominate, though, we get an increase in inequality. So this also means that, like, any party opposed to economic redistribution does have an incentive to attempt to focus on cultural issues rather than economic issues. Cultural issues are also arguably in most cases harder to compromise directly on. Many of these are about identities. I don't think it's necessarily entirely impossible to compromise, but compromise may be seen as undesirable, because we view these as fundamental moral norms and ideals. Whereas in the economic case, there's a case where, like, one party thinks we should have the highest tax bracket at 40, the other thinks we should have it 30. We get to 35%, or it, functionally as it has done, it bounces around depending on which party is in control and can get legislation, but, like, it bounces around within a certain range. We raise and lower taxes, and we don't see this whole, like, all or nothing space, which is not to say there's not conflict and sometimes toxic conflict, but it is to say that economic issues often are slightly easier to point to compromise positions on. And then, the key point, and we've made this before, is that having overlapping identities rather than cross-cutting identities makes politics toxic, right? You could be a union member opposed to immigration who lives in a multiracial neighborhood, and take some of your politics from the union, some from your neighbors, some from your own views on immigration, some from your educational identity, depending on what that is. I guess I didn't specify in this example. But, right, like, we could have these cross-cutting identities where, like, this hypothetical union member could have some identities that associate them with left-wing issues and some with right-wing issues. And thus, like, while they have this tension, that also means that, there are sort of swing voter, and they're also have some bridges available to build empathy with the other side. Like, some of their identities overlap, and thus they have, some ability to see and empathize more concretely with what's going on. But when we start sorting, like, our geography and our workplace and all of that, we get these identities that consistently line up and leave a huge gap between us and people on the other side of political conflicts. Speaking of that, looking at, like, the rules of democracy here in chapter 7, his point and why there are concerns about democracy is that strong disagreement over the rules can threaten the entire system. And one of the things I want to add, and we've talked about information bubbles a lot, and I think I've mentioned or maybe briefly referred to this study before, but there's a study that shows, and it's linked in the slides here, that information bubbles do make this worse, but it's not only an online problem, and this is something I want to stress. So if you look at, like, ideological segregation in terms of what sort of medium we have, like, people you trust, family, neighborhood, work, and voluntary associations are all at the top of being, like, ideologically segregated, right? Even zip code is more segregated than internet. So, like, online, arguably more segregated than broadcast news, magazines, cable, local news. So yes, there's a shift in news, but, like, some of the biggest stuff is your actual in-person interactions. And there's also a really good book about this called The Big Sort that traces, how we've become more geographically separated. This is more from a sociological perspective and looking at what that does to our politics as well. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say about these 3 chapters, although there's a lot of other interesting things in them, and looking forward to talking about it through these discussion questions this week.